Welcome to Diabetes Day by Day, the American Diabetes Association's official podcast. It's now the peak of summer. For some of us, summer is a time for travel or family vacations. It's also hurricane season. This week, we've seen Hurricane Beryl hit Texas, leaving millions without power or water. If you or a family member were affected, our hearts go out to you and our thoughts are with you. If you were not directly affected, this is a reminder to make sure to make the time to plan and to be prepared for how to manage your diabetes during a natural disaster or an emergency. Today, we have fantastic guests joining us to share their knowledge about getting prepared, whether it's for travel, for fun, or not fun during the case of a natural disaster. I'm Dr. Neil Skolnik, Professor of Family and Community Medicine in the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University, and joining me is my co-host.
I'm Dr. Sara Wettergreen, an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Skaggs School of Pharmacy and an ambulatory care clinical pharmacist.
Joining us today to talk about travel preparation is Dr. Steve Edelman. Dr. Edelman is a professor of medicine at the University of California in San Diego. He also has type 1 diabetes, and from that experience, founded and is director of a nonprofit organization called Taking Control of Your Diabetes. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Neil. I appreciate the invite.
And to provide expertise regarding disaster preparation, we have Kelly O'Neill joining us. Kelly is the Director of Marketing, Programs and Partnerships at the American Diabetes Association and has been very involved in the development of the Diabetes Disaster Response Coalition. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Let's start with travel. And Steve, one of those memories that I will never forget was when you and I were at a diabetes meeting in, of all places, Paris, and we were taking a long walk together around the city, and you kept looking at your glucose meter, and it had an arrow pointed down, and we were looking for, okay, I'll admit it, we were looking for a truffle store. I said I wanted to get my wife something special, a little tiny little few shavings of truffles. And you thought, though, I meant chocolate truffles. And do you want to tell the rest of the story?
Well, there's not much to it, but I remember it clearly because if you're a person with diabetes and you're getting low, and of course, I was not prepared. I should have had glucose tabs in my pocket or goo or whatever us type 1s usually have. You're in a strange city, you're doing excess exercise. So that's rule number one. What can go wrong will go wrong, especially when you're traveling. And so I really thought this was chocolate. And even though it's not the best thing to eat when you're low, it would have been fine. And we get to the store, I walk in and it's a bunch of dirt clogs. And I'm not even a truffle fan, but I know that pigs dig them up in the dirt. And make long story short, we ran across the street to a bar that looked like they were open. They weren't really open, but the owner or the worker was there and he sold us a couple Cokes and I lived to tell the story.
Yeah, and it was scary. It was scary, Steve. And it really is a reminder, no matter how much you know, and I don't know many people that know more than you do about diabetes, it's easy to forget the basics, the fundamentals. Do you want to share with our listeners some of those fundamentals that they ought to remember when it comes to travel, particularly international travel?
Yeah, and I think travel in general, I've done a lot of traveling in my day and way too much. And I would suggest that people type up a list that they can reuse on their trips. And I think you have to go down all the supplies and check them off. How many times I've gone on a trip, and even with my buddy Jeremy Pettis, who has type 1, he always forgets something. I got to pack for myself and him because I could on him to say, hey, do you have an extra sensor? Do you have an extra insulin pen? And obviously, depending on the length of your trip, this goes without saying, always bring extra because you put on a sensor, it goes bad when you insert it and then you're stuck. I use an Omnipod and sometimes they freeze up when you first start them or they get ripped off. You've got to have extra. And then you have to create and all your pills and other things that you're supposed to take, create a list and either print them up a bunch of times so you can use a fresh one each time. Make sure you have clean underwear on there too. And you go down and you check them off. And if you don't do that, if you're in a rush, you will forget something. The other thing I want to make clear is that people need to bring it on their carry-on, because if you check it, your luggage could get lost. And that's extremely important. If you have to check your luggage in, let's say there's no room in the overhead, you could ask the stewardess or the steward to say, hey, you got some insulin, you got some diabetes supplies, they cannot get lost. If you check them in as you get on the airplane, they usually give it to you right away when you get off. So that's okay. But I can just tell people what can go wrong will go wrong when you're on vacation. The other thing is, a lot of people feel they're on vacation. They don't really need to keep track of their diabetes that much. They'll take a diabetes vacation that way. But it's really the worst time to take a diabetes vacation, because you're in a new area, you're eating different foods, you're getting different types of exercise. You want to ruin your vacation? Get sick on your vacation from being extremely high or extremely low. And the other thing I'll just mention, I'll let you guys jump in there. Perhaps Kelly has a comment, or Sarah, or you, Neil, that it's good to know what kind of area you're in. Are there pharmacies there that you could go to? And are there emergency rooms or urgent cares that you may be able to access? It doesn't take that long to look up or call the concierge to the hotel you're going to. And you know what? If you ask, you'll never need one. But if you don't ask, you might need one.
I have a question, Steve. You have insulin pens or syringes, you have needles. Do you need some sort of note from your doctor in case someone asks that this is why you have that?
Yeah, Neil, that's a great question. And the answer is 99.9% of the time, you don't need it. I've traveled all over the world, and people at airports understand diabetes. And I've never needed a letter. I've never been questioned. In the United States, absolutely no problem. Other areas of the world, even when I went on a safari in Tanzania, there's diabetics all over the world. Airport security and personnel are extremely well trained. So don't bug your doctor about a letter you're not going to use, for sure.
Great.
You brought up a good point, though, Neil. What about keeping your insulin cold? And I tell people, you just need to keep it room temperature. You don't have to haul ice packs, ice holders. Make sure that when you get to the hotel room, the freezer works and doesn't freeze your insulin, because then that ruins it right away. And I also want to tell people that insulin is pretty tough stuff. And even if it denatures 5-10%, it still works. And that's why I love the insulin pens, because the cover protects the insulin from heat, light, and agitation. People don't realize that it's more than just heat. It's light, and it's sloshing around in a vial where half the insulin's gone. That leads to denaturation of the insulin. So people just need to be cautious. If you're going to a hot area, put it in the middle of your suitcase, insulated with your clothes, and that should be perfectly fine till you get to a hotel room.
That's great. I think there are so many special considerations to think about, and you've addressed many of them already. Different things to pack and things to be aware of, bringing extras. I think the storage is a very common question. And putting my pharmacist hat on, I often think of the things that you mentioned of, can I find a pharmacy there? So when I think about care in the United States, if you're traveling in the country that you live in, it's a little bit easier. They can transfer a prescription if there's an emergency. You can probably find the backup supplies that you want. But when I think about things like traveling internationally, the same supplies might not be available, or the same medications might not be available. So I wonder, Steve, are there any additional tips that you have for traveling internationally, since it sounds like you have robust experience with that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And in addition to diabetes supplies, I think it's good to have a little first aid kit, things for indigestion, things for diarrhea. If you eat something where you get sick, I think it's always good to have some bandages, not stuff that would take up your whole suitcase, but let's say you're on the beach and you step on a coral and you cut your foot. And I think it's good to have a 7 or at least 7 to 10 days of antibiotics that you know that you get along with, whether it's if you get an infection in your foot or if you get a urinary tract infection, maybe bring the supplies of issues that you may have totally unrelated to diabetes. I made a little first aid kit for my daughter that went to South America and just a little bit of everything. And you put it in a Ziploc bag, you get those pills that are in the pop outs, and you probably can give a better list than I could, Sarah. But I think it's always good to be prepared for other things as well. My last trip to the diabetes technology meeting in Florence, went on a bike trip to Sicily. And since I had a knee replacement, my knee was killing me and I didn't have any Voltaren. And I just went to a local pharmacy and luckily Italy is up to snuff and I got the 2% Voltaren. You can't buy that over the counter in the States, only 1%. So that was good. But I was lucky enough to be in an area where not only was there a stock pharmacy, but there was you didn't need a prescription. And I also got some triple antibiotic ointment for a cut I got on my arm. It really, during my clumsy crash on the bike. But yeah, I think so. The point is, think of all the other things that could bother you on a trip, and it will make your trip so much nicer. Even if you come back and you haven't used a single thing, that's success.
Exactly. I will say I recently got back from an international trip and I felt very happy to unpack all those emergency medications that I brought and thankfully didn't need. And I think some of the things that I might also recommend thinking about are thinking about access where you are. Is this a place with nationalized healthcare? And in that case, how will you access care in case of an emergency? Trying to be as best prepared as possible. Thinking about the locations you might go. Maybe you would consider travel insurance if you're more concerned about potentially having a glycemic related emergency when you're traveling overseas. And even thinking about being able to communicate well, having Google Translate or some other tool or learning a few key phrases where you can say things that you're looking for so you don't end up in that situation where you're looking for a glucose supply that's not available. It sounds like in your recent story that Neil was there was some misunderstanding about trying to find that sugar source. So trying to avoid those situations as best as possible and using things like a translator tool might be helpful in those emergency situations.
Yeah, I'll just add one 10-second thing.
Yeah.
Which is it's good to have the phone numbers of your healthcare system, the emergency room, where they can answer questions 24/7. And they'll be nice enough if you say you're traveling and you had a quick question about an illness, and they might be able to give you some direction.
Now, thankfully, I haven't had to manage much of these disasters or challenges internationally. I was traveling with a friend once and we had to go to the emergency room and it was a place with nationalized healthcare and it was actually a lot more affordable than I thought. So maybe it may not be too much of a concern or worry, but at least having that information. So in that situation, you know exactly what to do, I think is really useful. Any other thoughts?
Steve, before we move on to disaster planning, can you just tell us a few words about the organization that you run?
Thank you very much. I'll make it really quick. Called Taking Control of Your Diabetes. The website is TCOYD.org. And we did face-to-face conferences for 25 years. And then after COVID, we switched to virtual. And in a way, that was a silver lining, because if you go to our website, we have a big video vault for type 1, type 2, and we have an excellent presentation on traveling with diabetes. Nothing on disasters. We'll have to get Kelly to do something. But we've been able to now reach 3 million people a month in over 200 countries. Everything we offer is free and they can access it anytime. And thanks to AI, I could give a talk in Swahili and it comes out of my mouth perfectly translated from English in Swahili. Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. And once again, feel free to go visit the site. We have all kinds of educational programs.
And those educational programs aren't just informative, but they are fun. Steve, you make them fun. And that's all I'm going to say as a teaser to people who should go take a look. Let's transition now to Kelly to talk about natural disasters and emergency management. This is a big deal because things happen. They happen more often in some parts of the country than others. My son was in Florida, lives in Florida, when Hurricane Ian came through there with enormous flooding back 2 years ago. Kelly, can you start by telling us about the Diabetes Disaster Response Coalition and what that is, what that offers?
Thank you for having me. In August of 2017, residents of the Gulf Coast were bracing for a catastrophic storm, Hurricane Harvey. At the time, we were paying attention and watching, but it wasn't until several hours into that disaster, we started getting calls for help. Obviously, natural relief disaster agencies are on the forefront, Red Cross and FEMA, et cetera. But it was obvious that there are special people living with diabetes have special needs, and especially those requiring insulin. Within hours of hurricane hitting Texas coast, diabetes healthcare providers were reaching out to other individuals, and that included the American Diabetes Association. At the time, JDRF, which is now Breakthrough T1D, came together with Insulin for Life and formed a unique partnership to respond to those that initial outcall. Assessing the situation, trying to get a better sense of what was happening on the ground, talking with individuals there. We knew that what was really needed there is to make sure people had access to diabetes supplies, because with the flooded roads and power outages, pharmacies closed, we knew that there was going to be a special need. So we rallied together, and in a short period of time, within hours, we were able to rally truckloads of supplies to Houston. We had over 300,000 syringes, 150,000 pen needles, 340,000 units of insulin, nearly 6,000 test strips to get that on the ground and get started. And so that was our first foray in disaster response. And so it was pretty intense, but because we had so many partners that came together, it was not just Insulin for Life and the American Diabetes Association and Breakthrough T1D, but the Endocrine Society and the Association of Diabetes Educators, Research America, and others. And I want to make sure that this very clear. It was a coalition, and people should definitely visit our website, diabetesdisasterresponse.org, to see not only our resources, but the amazing individuals that were a part of this initial outreach and we were able to support. So that was the beginning.
That was such an impressive effort. Just hearing those numbers and seeing that level of response, it's critical, it's life-saving, and it's hard to do. It takes a whole coalition to make that level of effort happen. Neil?
I'm just in awe when I'm listening to that, and something to be so proud of. And it really reminds me of that saying that crisis, that those letters that represent both crisis and opportunity, that you stepped up and it created an opportunity for an ongoing set of resources. Now, when we think about resources and being prepared, are there some things that you can share with our listeners about things that they can ahead of time think about and do in order to be best prepared when the unexpected happens?
Yeah, absolutely. While sharing that, just to let you know, we were learning as we were going. We're not a disaster response organization by any means. And so we were learning and continued to learn, because I will add, just Hurricane Harvey hit, then we had Hurricane Irma, then we had Hurricane Maria, all in the same year. Each hurricane required a different response, but the one thing that we know 100% for sure, it is about preparedness. And that's our main message to everyone. Don't wait until the last minute. Be prepared. So we developed a diabetes disaster preparedness plan. It's available on our website, and it's basically a checklist to make sure. Obviously, we tell people have the basics that you need, right? In general, but for diabetes supplies, that making sure you're protecting your pump from water, making sure you have all your supplies to check your blood sugars, make sure you have extra of everything you possibly can. Obviously, making sure your insulin is protected. And I'm glad that Steve talked about that. And a lot of the points that he made is true, because there's a lot of things people get you're already distracted. Adding the layer on managing your diabetes is another level of a distraction. We want people to be prepared. So we developed a lot of resources. So how do you store insulin? That it's okay to have unexpired and non-refrigerated insulin, but working with doctors and making sure you're prepared and understand those things before you're in this disaster mode. Also, we know that you might be somewhere where you don't have your insulin with you. There might be access to other insulin. So we develop an insulin switching guide, which is a very detailed thing that has been peer reviewed and checked with our doctors. So we have a lot of amazing resources, and those are just a few to get started. We are constantly evolving and for each thing. So we've responded to some national wildfires. We've responded to some of the tornadoes that have hit. So each and every time we are definitely reminding people it's preparedness.
Now, can I ask you a question? There's certain things that everyone ought to pay attention to, like a backup power source, extra batteries if you're relying on CGM or a glucose pump. Things like that, things that are not that different than travel, making sure that you have a long enough supply of medicine to make it through the disaster.
Correct. And again, Steve showed how important it is to have enough items to treat your low blood sugars and items to treat your high blood sugars with you. It's great to kind of have empty boxes, so that when you're sharing if you don't have your sharps container with you, so you can safely store your syringes and needles and lancets. We suggest people obviously have their access to water and food and at least a 2-day supply of non-perishable things, but if they visit the website, they can download our preparedness guide and access that checklist to go through everything.
Great. I think that one thing that comes to mind as well is a waterproof, because many times floods are a big issue and we tend to keep our medicines, somewhere easily accessible. But if there's water coming through everywhere, whether it's a waterproof bag that they make for camping or a box, but something like that, does that also make sense?
Yeah, that's at the top of our list. We say make sure your diabetes kit can be stored in an easy to carry waterproof bag or container so it can hold all the documents that you need. Because in addition to your supplies, it would be great. Have your medications listed, have it in print so it's easily accessible, not just your diabetes medications, but all the medications that you have, right? Your allergies and your current medication, the dosing, when you take them, making sure that there's a list for all your diabetes care team that's accessible. Because if you're away from your traditional things, there might be a need for you to contact someone else that might be in need to contact someone from your diabetes care team. So you want to make sure you have a copy of all that information. We also recommend people with pumps, write down the make, the model, and the serial number to include the manufacturer's phone numbers in those cases, because if things get damaged, you want to be able to have all that stuff readily available for you.
That's fantastic. I'm even thinking of all of the resources and guides that I saw on the Diabetes Disaster Response Coalition website. And you're giving me the idea now of it would be great for people to also maybe print some of those and keep that with that packet. So in that crisis moment, you have the phone number you can call if you need that additional support. You have different strategies. If you can only access a different type of insulin, how are you going to manage that? And thinking of all those different pieces in the moment, I think would be really challenging when you're in crisis mode. So having that ahead of time is great. I'm even thinking now about the new technologies. So thinking about what does it take to keep all of your new technology running? Are you using your smartphone to access data from a device? And then that smartphone then becomes a critical piece. So how are you going to power that? Maybe having a backup battery pack that's charged at all times in case of an emergency, at least to get you by in some emergency situations if you don't have like a generator for full power supply. But so many different elements to think about. And I think we're just almost scratching the surface of what this can look like. And thinking about this, if someone's feeling a little unprepared right now, maybe they don't have this packet together, they don't have their emergency waterproof kit ready to go, where do you recommend that they start?
For inspiration, I've definitely just again remind people to go to Diabetes Disaster Response. We really have captured all the kind of things that we want people to know. So for a lot of for natural disasters, on the typical things, honestly, the Red Cross has a wonderful website for all the basic stuff that you could store. So the waterproof things they were talking about, the non-diabetes supply stuff that you really need to have. And then you can layer on the diabetes supply stuff with our resources. So I, again, definitely recommend people access the preparedness plan. It has a detailed checklist, and then, then get onto whatever website that you like to use most.
That's exactly right. So pairing those things together, you want to be prepared for disasters in every way possible, and diabetes is an element. And I really love the slogan of the organization, which is "Don't delay, prepare today." I think sometimes thinking about disaster preparation can feel a bit overwhelming, and you don't know exactly where to start or what types of disasters to prepare for if you're thinking of everything. And that's where I think these tools and resources can be really helpful in giving you the information that you need so that it's more of a checklist and you can just make sure you have that all ready to go. Steve, I know it sounds like you're someone who's really prepared. I wonder if you have any additional tips or information you could share.
What, living in San Diego, our biggest disaster is too sunny. It's sunburn, but we don't have any disasters out here. Do you guys remember last August, they had that big old storm? I think 4 leaves fell off a tree and everyone's panicking. But I do think I learned a lot from listening to Kelly. To me, it seems like, how can you predict there's going to be a disaster in the area you're going? At least it's an extension of packing extra supplies and even things that are not related to your diabetes that you might need if you get hurt, if you get sick, if you get diarrhea, drinking bad water in an area. And of course, look at the Weather Channel where you're going so that you can even at least be a little bit prepared if there's going to be a storm. And a lot of times, if you go to a sporting goods store like REI or Dick's Sporting Goods Store, they have a lot of waterproof stuff for people that go river rafting and things like that. So you might be able to get some things there. But I think Kelly's area is tougher than mine, because mine, you can predict what you're going to need, and disasters you cannot predict. So that was really good. I learned a lot. I took notes in case I ever leave San Diego.
But hey, I grew up in Southern California. I remember having a backup kit in case of an earthquake. So you never know what can happen in different regions.
Kelly, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
Not just final thoughts. I would just like to highlight a couple of other really important resources, and maybe even Sarah can share some of this. One of the things that you might find yourself in a disaster is without your prescriptions, without your medication, and then you may not have access to your pharmacy. Each state, usually during a disaster, will maybe enact what's called an emergency prescription refill waiver that will allow individuals to go to a pharmacy that may not be their pharmacy, and the pharmacist has the right through this emergency plan to be able to provide you additional refills. So know that there's additional resources available, and that during those kind of times, it might be something that you can talk to your healthcare provider, your insurance before a disaster, so you are just prepared. But that's one more thing for emergency prescription refills that I'd like to highlight. Also, the American Diabetes Association has the Center for Information. We have a 1-800 number, and that's available during times of crisis. We know sometimes people don't know where to go. We encourage them to call us, and we will help them in their journey. As well as we implemented what's called our healthcare provider hotline. And so we let healthcare providers know if they're in an area where there is a need for supplies, that they can call our hotline. We do not directly distribute supplies, but we can work with them to find the appropriate contacts. So there's a lot more resources available on the diabetesdisaster.org website. So please visit that. So again, I'm going to say it's preparedness, and don't delay, do it today.
Kelly, it's so helpful, and it's an important lesson that Steve and I can continue to learn from. Steve, any final thoughts that you have?
Well, you know what? I think Kelly said it all. No matter where you're traveling, over prepare and create a list so you don't forget anything. Bring extra, bring it as a carry-on. And if you don't prepare, I guarantee you'll have a disaster. So if you do prepare, you probably won't need anything. So don't leave your diabetes at home when you travel.
Great. Sarah, any last thoughts that you have?
My final thoughts are related to working with your care team on this. I think sometimes when you get started in disaster preparation, it can feel overwhelming. And so as you go through these materials, if you have questions, talk with your care providers about it. You might need extra prescriptions to allow you to fill extra insulin, extra diabetes supplies. Oftentimes your prescription or insurance is only covering exactly what you need in that time frame, but working with your care team to try to make sure you have those extra supplies available for those emergency kits and purposes is important.
Critically important information. Dr. Steve Edelman, Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. And most of all, of course, as always, to our audience, thank you for listening. We hope this information will inspire you, give you knowledge that you need to be prepared for, whether it is for travel or whether it's for things that are unexpected in the environment that will come up. Join us next month where we're going to discuss another element of getting prepared. And this is being prepared for going back to school or for starting college with diabetes. For the American Diabetes Association, I'm Dr. Neil Skolnik, and thanks for listening.